If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. That was Donald Trump on January 24th, threatening to economically annihilate Canada over a trade agreement that unlocked $3 billion for Canadian farmers, a deal Trump himself had praised just 8 days earlier. Not a policy disagreement, pure panic because Mark Carney flew to Beijing, sat down with President Xi Jinping and negotiated exactly the kind of bilateral trade deal Trump claims to celebrate. And the moment Carney stood on the world stage in Davos and explained why Canada did it, to build strategic independence from American economic coercion, Trump realized he was losing leverage. The whiplash is extraordinary. On January 16th, when Carney announced the China agreement after personally meeting Xi in Beijing, Trump told reporters it was smart business. Quote, "That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal." 8 days later, after Carney delivered a speech at Davos that received a standing ovation from global leaders, the exact same deal suddenly warranted economic warfare. What changed in 8 days? Carney stopped pretending Canada needed American permission. Today we're showing you how a trade deal that saved Canadian farmers became a weapon the instant Carney refused to bow, how Trump's 100% tariff threat reveals exactly what he fears most, Canadian economic independence, and how a $3 billion canola agreement became proof that American leverage over middle powers is collapsing in real time. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's be clear about what Carney actually negotiated in Beijing. This wasn't Canada selling out to China. This wasn't some grand realignment. This was targeted trade diplomacy addressing specific damage that had been destroying Canadian agricultural exports for over a year, and the numbers tell the story. In 2024, the Trudeau government imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada was following American and European Union leadership on China policy, being a reliable ally, coordinating trade restrictions with Washington. China retaliated immediately. In March 2025, Beijing hit Canadian canola oil with 100% tariffs. Peas, pork, seafood, including Atlantic lobster, all targeted with punishing duties ranging from 25% to 100%. Then, in August 2025, China escalated. Canola seed, Saskatchewan's lifeblood crop, got slammed with combined tariffs approaching 76%. An anti-dumping investigation was scheduled to conclude in March 2026, potentially making these tariffs permanent. Canadian farmers were getting obliterated. Saskatchewan alone produces over half of Canada's canola. China had been a $4 billion annual market. Without Chinese buyers, total canola exports collapsed by more than 2 million tons. Pork producers watched their margins evaporate. Lobster fishermen in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick saw their most lucrative market disappear overnight. Entire rural communities built around agricultural exports faced economic ruin, and Ottawa had no solution until Carney became Prime Minister and decided to negotiate directly. On January 16, 2026, Carney sat down with Xi Jinping in Beijing. The deal they struck was straightforward. Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the domestic market annually at a reduced tariff of 6.1%, down from 100%. That's roughly the number China was already exporting to Canada in 2023 before tariffs hit. It represents less than 3% of Canada's domestic auto market, not a flood, a controlled opening. In exchange, China agreed to drop canola seed tariffs to approximately 15% by March 1, 2026. Canola meal, which had faced separate restrictions, gets relief. Lobsters, crabs, peas, no longer subject to anti-discrimination tariffs through at least the end of 2026. The immediate impact, nearly $3 billion in export orders unlocked for Canadian producers. Saskatchewan Premier Mo, who traveled to Beijing with Carney, called it very good news for Canada and Saskatchewan. This is basic trade diplomacy. Canada had tariffs hurting Chinese EV manufacturers. China had tariffs destroying Canadian farmers. Both sides negotiated a compromise addressing their respective industries' concerns. Canola farmers get their market back. Chinese automakers get limited access to Canadian consumers. Nobody wins everything. Both
Tariffs
sides
as
gained
leverage.
something
Financial
concrete.
infrastructure as
Trump's
coercion.
initial reaction?
Supply chains as
Praise.
vulnerabilities
On January
to be
16th,
exploited.
speaking to reporters at
On
the White
Arctic
House,
sovereignty,
Trump said that's
we
what he should
stand
be doing.
firmly
It's a good thing for him to
with
sign a
Greenland
trade
and
deal.
Denmark and
If you
fully
can get a
support
deal with China,
their
you should
unique
do
right
that.
to determine
No criticism,
Greenland's
no
future.
threats, just acknowledgement that bilateral negotiation makes sense. Then, Carney went to Davos, and everything changed. On January
Our
20th,
commitment to NATO's
2026,
Article 5
Mark Carney
is
delivered an
unwavering.
address at the World Economic
So
Forum
we're
that will be
working
studied for
with
decades
our NATO
as the moment
allies, including
Canada
the
publicly
Nordic
declared
Baltic
independence
to
from
further
American
secure
economic
the
hegemony.
alliance's northern
The speech
and
was
western
titled
flanks,
Principled and
including
Pragmatic,
through
Canada's
Canada's
Path. The content was a systematic dismantling of the assumption that middle powers must remain subordinate to great power demands. Carney opened bluntly, quote, "We are in the midst
Canada
of a rupture,
strongly opposes
not a
tariffs
transition.
over Greenland
Over the
and
past 2
calls for
decades,
focused
crises in
talks
finance,
to
health,
achieve
energy, and
our shared
geopolitics exposed
objectives
the
of
risks of
security and
extreme global
prosperity in the
integration.
Arctic.
But recently, great powers began weaponizing economic relationships. Tariffs became leverage, financial infrastructure became coercion, supply chains became vulnerabilities to be exploited. He didn't say the United States, he didn't say Donald Trump, but when you're standing in Davos talking about great powers weaponizing tariffs while Trump is literally threatening NATO allies with economic punishment unless they support his Greenland annexation plans, everyone in that room knows exactly what you mean. Carney warned that the multilateral institutions middle powers relied on, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, international climate frameworks, are under assault. Countries are concluding they must develop strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, finance, and supply chains. Not isolation, independence. Then came the line that resonated globally. Middle powers must act together, because if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. The audience erupted, a standing ovation, unusual for the typically reserved World Economic Forum crowd. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed similar themes about Europe needing independence. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen talked about building strategic autonomy from American unpredictability. Carney laid out Canada's response, building strength at home, engaging broadly and strategically with open eyes, taking the world as it is, not waiting for a world Canada wishes existed, prioritizing relationships based on shared values while being ruthlessly pragmatic about diverging interests. And here's the key phrase: no longer relying just on the strength of values, but also on the value of strength. This was Canada announcing it would no longer automatically defer to American preferences, that bilateral relationships, including with China, would be pursued based on Canadian national interest, not Washington's approval, that economic diversification away from American market dependence wasn't just smart strategy, it was survival. Trump, who spoke at Davos the following day, was visibly furious. "Canada should be grateful to us," he said. "Canada gets a lot of freebies from the United States." He didn't specify what freebies because there aren't any. "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements." Carney responded calmly but with unmistakable steel. Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our own house. This is our country. This is our future. The choice is ours. That's when Trump's entire posture toward the China deal shifted. What had been a good thing 8 days ago suddenly became an existential threat requiring total economic warfare. On January 24th, Trump posted on Truth Social. He called Carney Governor Carney instead of Prime Minister, the same mocking nickname he used for Justin Trudeau when suggesting Canada become the 51st state. The Post accused Carney of being sorely mistaken if he thought Canada could become a drop-off port for Chinese goods flooding into the United States. Trump claimed China would eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. Then came the threat. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. This is extraordinary for multiple reasons. First, Canada already made the deal. It's done, announced, taking effect March 1st. Trump praised it January 16th. Now he's threatening retroactive punishment for something he previously supported. The timeline makes no sense unless you understand this isn't about the deal itself, it's about Carney refusing to ask permission.
Second, the deal has nothing to do with Chinese goods flooding into America. The 49,000 electric vehicles allowed into Canada at reduced tariffs are for the Canadian market. They're registered to Canadian owners. They're not being transshipped to the United States. Canada isn't becoming some trade loophole. The entire premise of Trump's threat is fiction. Third, a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods means economic catastrophe for both countries. Canada exported $352 billion in goods to the United States in 2024. American companies imported those goods because they needed them desperately. Lumber for construction, aluminum and steel for manufacturing, oil and natural gas for energy production, automotive parts for vehicle assembly. Doubling the price overnight would devastate American industries and send consumer prices through the roof. Construction costs would explode, energy prices would spike, auto production would halt. This isn't leverage, it's mutual destruction, and American businesses know it. Fourth, it would blatantly violate the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal Trump himself negotiated, signed, and called his signature achievement. The USMCA specifically prevents arbitrary tariff imposition. Trump would be shredding his own legacy from his first term. The legal challenges would be immediate and overwhelming. But none of that matters because the threat isn't actually about Chinese electric vehicles or trade loopholes or protecting American markets. It's about Carney standing in Davos and telling the world that Canada is building strategic autonomy. It's about a middle power demonstrating that American leverage isn't absolute. It's about Trump realizing he's losing control. Trump's panic reveals exactly what he fears most. For decades, Canada routed approximately 75% of its exports through the United States because alternatives didn't exist or weren't economically viable. Canadian businesses planned entire strategies around American demand. Canadian supply chains integrated seamlessly with American production. That dependence gave Washington enormous leverage. Threatened tariffs and Canadian governments would scramble to negotiate, demand policy changes, and Ottawa would seriously consider compliance, because access to American markets was treated as existential. Every Canadian Prime Minister understood the implicit bargain: you get market access as long as you don't challenge American priorities. Carney is systematically dismantling that leverage. The China deal is just one piece of a comprehensive strategy. He's negotiated new partnerships with Qatar on liquefied natural gas exports. He's strengthening ties with the European Union on critical minerals and clean technology. He's exploring deeper relationships with India after years of diplomatic strain under Trudeau. He's building the Churchill port infrastructure and Hudson Bay Railway to ship Canadian resources to Europe via Arctic routes, completely bypassing American ports and logistics. He's positioning Canada as the reliable alternative for countries tired of American unpredictability. Every partnership that diversifies Canadian trade is leverage Trump loses. Every alternative market Canadian businesses develop is economic pressure Washington can't apply. Every supply chain that bypasses American territory is independence Trump can't tolerate. The Davos speech made this explicit. Carney wasn't just talking about China or Europe or any single relationship. He was announcing a comprehensive grand strategy of strategic autonomy. Build strength at home, diversify partnerships globally, reduce vulnerability to coercion from any single power, and yes, especially the United States. Trump's panic reveals exactly what he fears most. Trump initially praised the China deal because he thought it was just two countries solving trade irritants, bilateral negotiation, transactional, no big deal. Then Carney stood in Davos and explained the China deal was part of a broader strategy to make Canada permanently less dependent on America. Suddenly, the exact same agreement became an existential threat.
This is why Ontario Premier Doug Ford's criticism of the deal missed the point entirely. Ford warned the EV tariff reduction could hurt Canada's auto sector and called Chinese vehicles spy cars on wheels. He said the deal would tick off the Americans. He was right about the last part, but wrong about the reason. Trump isn't mad about 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles entering the Canadian market. He's mad that Canada negotiated with Beijing independently, that Canada demonstrated Canadian national interests don't automatically align with American demands, that Canada showed other middle powers that alternatives to American economic dominance exist and are achievable. The same day Trump threatened 100% tariffs, he also revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, a bizarre $1 billion vanity project supposedly overseeing global peace processes. Carney had expressed cautious interest after Davos. Trump withdrew the invitation not over policy disagreements, but because he didn't like a speech. The invitation withdrawal was meant as punishment. Instead, it proved everything Carney said in Davos was correct. Loyalty is the only currency Trump recognizes. Disagree publicly, and you're out. The pattern is consistent and predictable, and it validates exactly why strategic autonomy is necessary. American reliability under Trump is zero. Now, let's be realistic about enforcement. Trump's 100% tariff threat is probably unenforceable. It would require congressional approval for permanent implementation.
Gateway to resources that the global economy increasingly depends
governments, and international
Control
trade
over
organizations
access to the
in
passage
opposition.
becomes control
Legal
over the
challenges
flow
under
of those
USMCA
materials.
would be immediate.
That is where the
The
$900
economic
billion
damage to
figure
American
comes
industries
from.
would be
It reflects the
catastrophic.
combined
But the
value of
threat
trade,
itself does
extraction,
damage.
infrastructure,
Canadian
and
businesses
strategic
planning
leverage
investments
projected
now
over
must
the next
factor
3
in the
decades.
risk that Trump
And that
could
value sits at the
arbitrarily
heart of a
double their
sovereignty
export
dispute
costs.
that has simmered
Companies
for nearly
considering
80
expanding
years.
production in
Canada has
have
claimed
to
the
account for
Northwest
American
Passage
market
as
access
internal
suddenly
waters
becoming
since
unreliable.
1946.
The
The
uncertainty
legal
alone
reasoning is
discourages
straightforward
economic
under Canadian
activity
law.
and proves
The
Carney's
waterways
point about
run through
diversification.
Canadian territory,
Carney's
weaving
response will
between
likely be
islands
measured.
that are
Canada
unquestionably
won't
Canadian.
retaliate immediately.
Under this view,
Ottawa will
vessels
continue
crossing the
implementing
passage
China
should
deal
require
because the
Canadian
benefits
permission.
for Canadian
In the
farmers
same
are
way,
real,
ships entering the
immediate,
St.
and
Lawrence
substantial.
River or
Carney
navigating
will
the
keep
Great
building
Lakes do.
alternative partnerships
The United
because
States has
reducing
rejected
dependence
that
on American
position
markets
consistently.
is now obviously
Washington argues
necessary,
that the
not
Northwest
just
Passage
strategically
qualifies
wise.
as an
Other middle
international
powers are
strait
watching
under maritime
intently.
law,
If Canada
granting
can
all
negotiate
vessels the
with
right of
China
transit
despite
passage without
American
seeking
objections,
permission.
if Carney
Canada
can give
may set
speeches
environmental
criticizing
and
great
safety
power
standards,
coercion
but it cannot
without
deny
facing
access.
actual economic
This disagreement
annihilation,
remained manageable
if
for
strategic
decades
autonomy is
because the
achievable
passage
rather
itself
than
had limited
theoretical,
practical
then other
value.
countries will follow.
As long as ICE made
That's what
transit
Trump
rare,
fears most.
the legal debate
not
stayed
Canadian
mostly
electric
academic.
vehicle imports.
The
not
deeper
China
problem for
using
Canada was
some
not
mythical
legal theory,
drop-off
but
boat.
enforcement.
The possibility
Sovereignty
that
means
American
little without the
economic
ability to
dominance is
exercise
optional.
it. For
That middle
decades,
powers
Canada
can chart
lacked the
independent
infrastructure
courses,
and military
that threats
presence
and
needed to
coercion
control the
eventually
Arctic in
backfire
any
when
meaningful
pushed too
way.
far.
The Canadian
Trump
Armed
thought demanding
Forces conducted
subordination
limited
would force
annual
compliance.
exercises in the region.
Instead, he's
A
triggering
small number of
exactly the kind of
Rangers patrolled
strategic
vast
autonomy
distances with
Carney
minimal
described
support.
in Davos. Every
Coast Guard
threat makes
vessels
alternatives
operated
more
only during
attractive.
short summer
Every
seasons.
insult makes
There were no
independence
deep
more
water
appealing.
ports capable
Every
of servicing
arbitrary
large
tariff
ships,
announcement
no permanent
proves that
military
American
bases,
reliability
and
is
no
gone,
comprehensive
and
surveillance
diversification
network to
is
track
survival.
traffic moving through
Let's
the
return to
passage.
the central
Monitoring
absurdity
vessels
one
was
final
difficult.
time. On
Stopping them
January
was nearly
16th,
impossible.
Trump said Carney
In that
signing a
environment,
trade deal
other
with
powers
China
acted
was a good
accordingly.
thing. By
The
January
United States
24th,
treated the
the
passage
exact
as
same
open
deal
water.
warranted threatening
Russia
to
invested
destroy
heavily
the
in
Canadian
Arctic
economy.
infrastructure,
Nothing
building
about
a
the
fleet
agreement
of around
changed.
50
The terms
icebreakers
remained
and establishing
identical.
military bases
49,000
along its northern
Chinese
coast.
EVs at reduced
China
tariffs.
began calling
Chinese
itself a
tariff
near-Arctic
relief on
state
canola,
and
lobster,
sent research
pork.
vessels through the
Benefits
region.
for Canadian agriculture.
Canada
Costs
objected
for Canadian
diplomatically
auto
and watched
sector.
those objections
Net positive
fade into
for
the background.
Canadian economy.
Churchill
What changed
represented
was
only the
Carney's
starting
willingness
point.
to publicly
The broader
explain
Arctic
why the deal
Infrastructure
mattered,
Fund
not
targeted
just as
northern
bilateral
airports,
trade,
all
but as
weather
part of
roads linking
Canada
remote
building the
communities and mining
partnerships and
sites,
strategic autonomy
expanded Coast Guard
necessary to
operations,
withstand
new radar
economic
and
coercion
surveillance
from great
systems,
powers
and
who
military
treat
facilities
integration
capable of
as
supporting
subordination.
year-round deployments.
Trump praised the deal
The most
when he thought
consequential
Canada was being
investment was
transactional.
$7 billion
Negotiate
for
with
two
whoever
new
offers
head
good
operators,
terms. Fine,
from refueling
as long
and
as
repairs
Canada
to emergency
ultimately
support.
still defers
Control
to American
exercised
leadership.
daily
The
outweighs
moment Carney
arguments
made
made
clear
in
the
courtrooms.
deal represented
This shift
Canadian
carries
independence
consequences
rather
far
than
beyond
tactical
Canada
bargaining.
and the United
Trump
States.
panicked.
China
the 100%
and Russia are
tariff
watching
threat
closely.
is Trump admitting
If Washington
Carney is
maintains
right.
its
If
position
American
that the
leverage
Northwest
depends on
Passage is
Canadian
an
independence,
international
and
strait,
Canada is
that
actively
logic
reducing
applies
that
to
dependence,
all nations
then Trump's
equally.
only response is
Chinese
escalation.
and Russian vessels
Threaten
gain the same
complete
rights of
economic
transit
severance.
claimed by
Hope
American
the threat
ships.
alone forces submission.
That outcome
But
undermines
Carney
North
already
American
addressed this in
security at its
Davos.
foundation.
Sovereignty that was once
NORAD
grounded in
exists to
rules
defend the
will
continent
increasingly
from
be
threats
record in the capacity to resist coercion.
Unrestricted
the question
access
isn't
to
whether to
Arctic waters
adapt
near
to
North
great power
America
rivalry.
weakens
The
that
question is whether
defensive
middle
perimeter.
powers build walls
Some
or
American
create
strategists
genuine
have begun to
cooperation among
acknowledge this
themselves.
contradiction privately,
Canada is choosing
questioning whether
cooperation
supporting
with
Canadian
China on
sovereignty might
agriculture
better
and
serve
limited auto
long-term
access,
security
with
interests.
Europe on critical minerals
Such a
and
shift
energy,
would
with
require
Qatar
admitting
on
decades
LNG,
of error
with
and
other middle
accepting
powers
that
who
Canada
recognize
controls
American
access
reliability
to a corridor
under Trump
valued
is gone,
at
and
$900 billion.
alternatives must be built.
That recalibration
Every
has not
partnership
occurred,
makes Trump's
and time
threats
is
less
not
effective.
on Washington's side.
Every alternative
The greatest
market
irony
reduces
lies in
American
how
leverage.
American pressure
Every
reshaped the
demonstration that
strategic
Canada
landscape.
can thrive without
Russia has
American
spent
permission
decades preparing for an
undermines the
Arctic future,
subordination Trump
building
demands.
icebreakers,
The
bases,
China deal
and
was
shipping
always
routes
going to benefit
designed to
Canadian
move up to
farmers.
100
That's
million
why
tons
Trump
of cargo
initially praised
annually
it.
through
But
its
after
northern
Davos,
sea route by
after
2030.
Carney's speech made
China,
clear this was
despite
about
its distance
strategic
from the
autonomy
Arctic Circle,
and not just
has
trade.
invested heavily
the
in
deal
icebreaker
became evidence
technology,
that Canada is
scientific
escaping
research
American
missions,
control. And
seabed
Trump,
mapping,
faced with a
and
middle power
diplomatic ties
refusing to
with
stay on the
Arctic
menu,
nations.
threatened to burn
For
down
years,
the entire
Canada
relationship
and the United States
rather than
worked
accept
together
that
to
leverage
counter
has
that
limits
expansion.
and coercion
Trade
eventually
conflicts
fails.
fractured
That's
that
not strength.
unity.
That's panic.
As Canada
and the
diversified its
100% tariff
partnerships,
threat proves
options once
everything
considered
Carney said in
politically
Davos was
unthinkable
exactly
became
correct.
discussable.
Strategic autonomy
While direct
isn't
cooperation
optional
with
anymore.
Russia
It's
remains
mandatory.
unlikely due to
Canada
broader
just showed the
geopolitical
world how it's
tensions,
done.
China